Hello and welcome to the BBC's News at 6. There are new allegations that the most senior staff at the News of the World knew much more about phone hacking than they've admitted so far. A letter from the paper's former royal editor, Clive Goodman, says hacking was regularly discussed at editorial meetings. It raises tough questions for Andy Coulson, a former editor of the News of the World, who went on to become one of David Cameron's closest advisers. This report from our business editor, Robert Peston, contains some flash photography.
Clive Goodman, disgraced former royal editor of the News of the World, imprisoned in 2007 for phone hacking. A letter he wrote in March 2007 has returned to haunt the owner of the now closed Sunday tabloid, the Murdoch's News International. Obtained by the Culture Select Committee, which is investigating phone hacking, Mr Goodman wrote in the letter that phone hacking was widely discussed in the daily editorial conference until explicit reference to it was banned by the editor. The letter then refers to this chap, Tom Crone, News International's former legal manager, and this one, Andy Coulson, editor of the News of the World from 2003 to 2007. Mr Goodman wrote, Tom Crone and the editor promised on many occasions that I could come back to a job at the newspaper if I didn't implicate the paper or any of its staff in my mitigation plea. I didn't, and I expect the paper to honour its promise to me.
I can only assume that there's been a cover-up. This letter is absolutely devastating. Clive Goodman's testimony shows that he believed that others, every member of the editorial team was aware of phone hacking and the police were not told about it.
And if it's true that Andy Coulson knew about phone hacking, more questions will be asked about why David Cameron employed him as his communications director and took him into Downing Street after the last election. Mr Coulson's ultimate boss, Rupert Murdoch, and his son James Murdoch say they didn't probe the extent of phone hacking at the News of the World till recently because of advice they received in a letter from a law firm, Harbottle and Lewis, that the hacking was limited.
Because it is a key bit of outside legal advice from senior counsel that was provided to the company rested on.
Now, what's very embarrassing for James Murdoch is that a long report written by the relevant firm of solicitors, Harbottle and Lewis, for the Select Committee, says that Mr Murdoch was completely wrong to rely on their 2007 letter as being evidence that there wasn't widespread wrongdoing at the News of the World. Harbottle and Lewis says they didn't conduct a detailed, thorough investigation. What they did was a very narrow piece of work relating to an employment dispute. And what's equally embarrassing for James Murdoch is that John Chapman, the legal affairs director of News International at the time, corroborates Harbottle and Lewis's version of events.
The critical question for the Murdochs is the question of whether or not in time they will come to be seen to have told the whole truth to the Parliamentary Committee.
News International said tonight that it recognises the seriousness of materials disclosed to the police and Parliament and is committed to working in a constructive and open way with all the relevant authorities. The News of the World may no longer be rolling off the presses, but questions about the scandal can't be killed, such as why Mr Goodman's shocking letter wasn't immediately passed to the police by News International.
And Robert's with me now. Robert, let's be clear. This is a former staff, a former employee, and the News International's own lawyers who are raising these latest concerns.
Yes, I mean, they are quite shocking, but as ever with this extraordinary scandal, there are as many unanswered questions as there are answers. For example, one of the things we've learned tonight is that Clive Goodman, a convicted felon who was trying to be dismissed by the News of the World for gross misconduct, well, the News of the World, News International, ended up paying him £244,000. Why did they pay him £244,000? After he'd been dismissed, after he left prison. Second hugely interesting question is whether Andy Coulson, who went on to become Director of Communications for David Cameron in Downing Street, who was editor of the News of the World, whether he was ever shown this extraordinary, shocking letter written by Clive Goodman, and then whether he ever told David Cameron that there was this formal allegation against him in a letter by a former colleague saying that he had promised to that former employee that he would re-employ him so long as that employee didn't implicate other members of staff at the News of the World in phone hacking? Was the Prime Minister told about this allegation against Mr. Coulson? And then finally, there are these big questions for Rupert and James Murdoch about why they rested on a letter from a firm of solicitors, Harbottle and Lewis, which that firm now says proved next to nothing about whether or not wrongdoing was rife at the News of the World.
Robert, thank you. Thanks very much. Now, rail commuting